The room was quiet when my name came up. Not silent, just the kind of quiet where people avoid looking at you. That was the first sign. He didn't say it directly. He never did. He just looked at the numbers on the screen, then at me, like I was already supposed to understand something no one had explained. 30% of the team was gone by the end of that week, and somehow their work didn't disappear with them. It shifted, slowly, quietly, onto my desk. No one asked if I could handle it. No one checked if it made sense. They just assumed I would absorb it. And when I didn't respond the way they expected, that's when everything changed. I used to measure my days in quiet routines, not because I preferred silence, but because it was the only way to stay consistent in a place where everything else felt loosely defined. I arrived at the same time every morning, a few minutes earlier than required. Not early enough to be noticed, just early enough to avoid attention. The office always looked the same at that hour. Screens still dark, chairs pushed in, the air slightly colder before the systems warmed up. It gave me time to settle into my work before anyone else arrived. No interruptions, no unnecessary conversations, just structure. My role was clear when I started, defined responsibilities, specific outputs. A predictable rhythm of tasks that made sense when you looked at them over a week instead of a day. I handled my work carefully, not quickly. I checked things more than once. I avoided mistakes not because I was afraid of them, but because I knew how they were treated. Mistakes were remembered longer than consistency. So I stayed consistent. My boss never had to follow up with me. That was something I understood early. He did not manage closely, but he noticed patterns. If something slipped, even slightly, he would not react immediately. He would wait, observe, then bring it up later in a way that made it feel like it had always been obvious. I learned to avoid that. Our interactions were minimal, structured. He spoke in short sentences, rarely repeating himself. When he gave instructions, they were efficient but not detailed. I filled in the gaps on my own. It seemed expected. I didn't take that personally. It was just how things worked. There were others on the team who operated differently. Louder voices, faster responses, people who asked questions openly even when the answers were unclear. They had more visible interactions with him, more direct exchanges. I watched those moments carefully, not to compare but to understand. There was a pattern. Attention did not always mean approval. Sometimes it meant correction. Sometimes it meant pressure. The ones who stayed out of those cycles seemed to last longer. I chose to stay out. With my coworkers, things were simple. Polite conversations, occasional collaboration when tasks overlapped. Nothing personal, no deep connections, just enough familiarity to keep things moving without friction. No one asked much about me, and I didn't offer anything. It made everything easier. There was an unspoken agreement across the team. Everyone carried their own responsibilities. You didn't interfere unless it was necessary. You didn't question assignments unless something broke completely. And most of the time, nothing did. The system felt stable, not perfect, but stable enough to trust. Work came in, work went out, metrics were met, reviews happened on schedule. There were no surprises, or at least none that reached me. I assumed that meant things were functioning the way they were supposed to. When decisions were made above us, they stayed above us. I never expected to be part of those discussions. That was not my role. I focused on what was in front of me. It felt safe. Not comfortable in a personal sense, but predictable. Controlled. The kind of environment where effort translated directly into outcome, even if no one acknowledged it out loud. I didn't need recognition. I needed stability. And for a long time, that's what I believed I had. Even when small things didn't make sense, I ignored them. Delayed responses, slight shifts in priorities, tasks that arrived without context. I treated them as temporary inconsistencies, not patterns. Because patterns would have meant something else, something intentional. I wasn't looking for that. I trusted that if there was a problem, it would be addressed directly. That if something changed, it would be communicated clearly. That roles existed for a reason and boundaries would be maintained. No one told me otherwise, so I stayed within mine. I worked. I delivered. I kept my head down, and I believed that was enough to keep things where they were. Looking back, I realize how much of that belief was built on silence. Not confirmation, just absence of disruption. At the time, it felt like trust. Now I understand it was something else, something quieter, something easier to overlook, and something that made everything that followed possible. The first change was not obvious. It didn't arrive as an announcement or a visible shift in structure. It showed up in smaller ways, things that could be explained if I chose not to look too closely. I noticed it in the timing of messages. Instructions that used to come at the start of the day began arriving later, sometimes mid-afternoon, occasionally close to the end of the workday. They were shorter than before, less context, just enough detail to complete the task, but not enough to understand where it fit. At first, I assumed it was temporary, maybe scheduling issues, maybe something happening at a higher level that required adjustments. It wasn't unusual for priorities to shift, and I had learned to adapt without asking too many questions. So I adjusted. I reorganized my time, moved things around to accommodate late instructions, stayed a little longer when necessary, not as a statement, just to maintain continuity. It seemed like the practical thing to do, but the pattern didn't correct itself. It became consistent. At the same time, I started noticing small tasks appearing in my workflow that didn't belong there. They were related to other roles, adjacent responsibilities, not mine. Nothing large, nothing that would raise immediate concern, just misplaced. The first time it happened, I thought it was a simple routing error. I completed the task and moved on. It was faster than sending it back and waiting for clarification. The second time, I hesitated. I checked the system, looked at the assignment trail. It had been directed to me intentionally. No notes, no explanation, just assigned. I considered asking, but the task itself was straightforward. It didn't disrupt my schedule significantly, so I completed it again. It felt easier that way. Conversations around me began to change as well, not in what was said, but in what wasn't. There were more private discussions, small groups forming near desks, voices lowered just enough to signal that something was being contained. When I approached, the conversations would shift, either ending quickly or redirecting to something neutral. No one excluded me directly, they just adjusted. I didn't take it personally, not at first. Teams go through phases. Information moves unevenly. Not everything is relevant to everyone. That was how I explained it to myself. Still, I noticed. My boss became harder to read during this time. Not more distant, just less defined. His responses when I asked for clarification were brief, sometimes delayed. Occasionally, they didn't come at all. When they did, they answered the surface of the question without addressing the underlying uncertainty. I adapted to that too. I stopped asking as often. Instead, I relied on what I could see, patterns in previous tasks, expectations based on past outcomes. It wasn't perfect, but it kept things moving. There was one moment that stayed with me longer than the others. It was small. I had completed a task that required input from another department. Normally, there would be a short exchange, confirmation, maybe a quick adjustment. This time, the response came back already finalized, as if decisions had been made before my involvement. My contribution was still there, but it didn't change anything. I reviewed the timestamps. The sequence didn't align with the usual process. Steps had been taken out of order. Approvals logged earlier than expected. It wasn't an error. It was prearranged. I closed the file without commenting. There wasn't enough there to question directly, not without making it seem like I was looking for problems. And I told myself that, but the thought stayed. More tasks followed, slightly outside my scope but still manageable. The volume wasn't overwhelming yet, just noticeable if I paid attention. So I tried not to. I focused on completion, on maintaining the same level of accuracy I had always held. If something was changing, I assumed it would become clear in time. Clarity, I believed, came from consistency. If I stayed consistent, the situation would either stabilize or reveal itself. That was the logic I held onto, even as small details continued to shift, even as the space between what I was told and what I could observe began to widen. It still felt explainable, not comfortable, but explainable enough to ignore. And at that point, ignoring it still felt like the correct decision, because nothing had broken yet. Nothing had crossed a line that couldn't be reinterpreted as coincidence. So I stayed where I was, quiet, observant, waiting for something that would make it undeniable. I didn't realize how close that moment already was. The layoffs happened without a transition. There was no gradual shift, no visible preparation, just a short meeting notice that appeared on the calendar, marked as mandatory with no agenda attached. I joined on time. Cameras were off, microphones muted, the usual format. My boss spoke briefly, measured, controlled, as always. He didn't explain the reasoning in detail. He didn't open the floor for questions. He stated the outcome. 30% of the team would be leaving, effective immediately. There was a pause after he said it, not long, but long enough for the weight of it to settle. Then the meeting ended. No discussion. No names mentioned. Just a follow-up email that came minutes later, confirming that access for certain individuals had already been revoked. I didn't know who was gone until I noticed who wasn't there the next morning. Empty desks, inactive profiles, conversations that stopped mid-thread with no closure. The system had already adjusted. Tasks were reassigned automatically, or at least that's how it appeared at first. Workflows shifted. Queues redistributed. It looked structured from the outside. But when I opened my own task list, the structure didn't match what I expected. There were new entries. Not one or two, but enough to interrupt the balance I had maintained for months. I scrolled through them slowly, recognizing names attached to tasks, people who were no longer there. At first, I assumed it was temporary. A short-term redistribution until roles were clarified. That would have been reasonable, necessary even. So I began working through them. One task led to another. Some required background context I didn't have. I searched for documentation, pieced together information from previous records, filled in gaps where I could. It took longer than usual, but I completed them. No one said anything. No acknowledgement, no adjustment, just more tasks appearing as the day went on. I checked the team dashboard. Others had new assignments as well, but not at the same volume. Their workloads had increased slightly. Mine had shifted significantly. I compared timelines. The deadlines attached to these new tasks hadn't changed. They were set based on the original workload distribution, not the new reality. I paused there, not because I couldn't continue, but because the numbers didn't align. More work, same time, no explanation. I waited for clarification. It didn't come. Instead, I received a brief message from my boss later that afternoon. Not a conversation, just a single line attached to one of the tasks. Please prioritize accordingly. No reference to the increased volume. No acknowledgement of the shift, just an expectation. I read it more than once, not for the instruction itself, but for what it avoided. There was no recognition that anything had changed. That was the first moment it felt intentional, not the layoffs. Those could be explained by external factors, budget adjustments. Strategic decisions made at levels I wasn't part of. But the way the work moved afterward, that was internal, directed. I started paying closer attention, not outwardly. I didn't ask questions. I didn't raise concerns. I continued working at the same pace, maintaining the same level of accuracy. But I began to track things quietly. Task origins, assignment timestamps, completion expectations. Patterns started to form. Work from multiple roles was being rooted into my queue more frequently than others. Not exclusively, but consistently enough to stand out when viewed over time. I cross-checked with what I could see of my coworkers' assignments. They had increases, I had accumulation. The difference was subtle if you looked at a single day, clear if you looked at a week. I didn't share this with anyone. There was no one to share it with in a way that wouldn't create complications. And at that point, I still wasn't certain what it meant, only that it was happening. My boss remained unchanged in his behavior, calm, measured, distant. If he noticed the shift, he didn't indicate it. If he had directed it, he didn't acknowledge it. That absence became its own signal. By the end of the week, the workload had settled into a new pattern, not temporary, sustained. I adjusted again, reorganized my process, prioritized based on urgency rather than sequence, extended my hours slightly, just enough to keep pace. From the outside, nothing appeared broken, but internally, something had shifted. The balance that had defined my role was gone, replaced by something less clear. Something that required more from me without explaining why. That was when the first real question formed, not about the workload itself, but about why it had been directed this way, and why no one had said it out loud. I didn't have the answer yet, but I stopped assuming there wasn't one. I waited longer than I should have before saying anything, not because I didn't see the imbalance, but because I understood how it would sound if I raised it too early. Without something clear, something measurable, it would come across as resistance, or worse, as inability. So I gave it time. I adjusted my workflow, extended my hours where I could without making it visible, reorganized priorities so the most critical tasks were always completed first. From the outside, everything still appeared stable, but the strain was becoming structural. Deadlines began overlapping in ways they hadn't before. Tasks that required focus were interrupted by urgent requests that carried no context. I found myself moving between different types of work without transition, switching processes midstream just to keep pace. The errors started small, nothing obvious, a delay in response, a detail that needed revision. Each one isolated, explainable on its own, but I noticed how quickly they were recorded, not addressed, recorded. That was when I decided to speak. I chose a moment that wouldn't draw attention. A short window after a scheduled update when most people had already disconnected. I sent a message to my boss, clear, direct, without emotion. I outlined the volume, the shift in responsibilities, the overlap in deadlines. I didn't frame it as a complaint. I presented it as a clarification request, a need to align expectations with the current workload. The response came later than usual, short, controlled. This is an opportunity to demonstrate capacity. I read it once, then again, looking for anything beyond the surface. There was nothing, no acknowledgement of the change, no adjustment to the expectations, just a reframing of the situation into something that implied growth, not imbalance. I replied with specifics, task counts, timelines, comparisons to previous weeks. I kept the language neutral, focusing only on what could be measured. The next response came faster. Time management will be important here. That was the first time the direction shifted toward me. Not the workload, me. I paused before responding again. There was a pattern forming in the way the conversation was being redirected. Each time I brought it back to the structure of the work, the response moved it toward my ability to handle it. Skill, efficiency, capacity, none of which addressed the original point. I stopped pushing. Not because the issue was resolved, but because it was clear the conversation wouldn't move forward in that format. The next few days made that clearer. In meetings, my updates were shortened. Where others were asked follow-up questions, mine were acknowledged and then moved past quickly. Not ignored completely, just reduced. When I mentioned delays caused by overlapping tasks, the response was consistent. We all need to adapt. It was said generally, not directed, but the timing aligned too precisely to be unintentional. Coworkers began adjusting their behavior as well, not openly, just small shifts. Less direct communication, fewer collaborative exchanges. When tasks overlapped between us, the boundaries became more defined. Responsibilities that might have been shared before were now kept separate, contained. I noticed that when issues came up involving my work, they were addressed in broader discussions rather than directly with me, framed as general observations about quality or timing. It created distance, and something else, doubt, not loud or immediate, gradual. I started reviewing my own work more frequently, not for accuracy, but for confirmation, looking for patterns that would explain the responses I was receiving. I didn't find them. The work itself hadn't changed, only the interpretation of it. That was the part I couldn't align. The workload remained high. The expectations remained undefined. And the feedback, when it came, was no longer connected to specific outcomes. It was suggestive, open enough to be interpreted in multiple ways, but always leaning in the same direction, that I was not managing it correctly, that I was falling behind even when the metrics didn't fully support that. I stopped relying on verbal feedback after that. It wasn't consistent enough to measure. Instead, I focused on what could be tracked: completion times, error rates, task volume, things that existed outside of interpretation. If there was a disconnect between perception and reality, I needed to understand where it was coming from. Because at that point, the situation was no longer just about workload. It was about narrative, and the way that narrative was being shaped without anything being said directly. I stayed quiet, not because I agreed with it, but because reacting to it without something concrete to anchor to would only reinforce it. So I let it continue, watched it, recorded it in small ways without making it visible, and waited for something that couldn't be redirected. Something that would exist beyond interpretation. Because until then, anything I said would be turned back on me, and I had started to understand that was part of the structure. The system did not change its behavior. That was the first thing I confirmed. No matter how the conversations shifted, no matter how the expectations were framed, the underlying structure, the logs, the timestamps, the assignment trails, remained consistent. They recorded everything without interpretation. And unlike conversations, they didn't adjust their meaning depending on who was reading them. I started there, not with assumptions, not with conclusions, just with what existed. Every task assigned to me carried a record: origin point, time of assignment, previous owner if there was one. I began reviewing them at the end of each day, not as part of my work, but as a separate process. At first, I only needed a few minutes. Then it became longer. Patterns don't reveal themselves immediately. They build slowly across repetition, so I let them. I tracked the volume over time, not in general terms, but precisely. How many tasks were assigned daily, how many were completed, how many carried over. I compared it to previous weeks before the layoffs. The difference was not subtle when viewed that way. It was measurable. Then I looked at distribution, not just mine, but what I could access of the team's overall workload. The system didn't show everything, but it showed enough. Assignment categories, general counts, timelines. Others had increases. Mine was disproportionate. I didn't need to interpret it. The numbers aligned on their own. Still, numbers alone don't explain intent. They only show outcome. So I moved deeper into the records. Assignment histories. Some tasks had been reassigned more than once before reaching me. I followed those trails backward, step by step. In several cases, they originated from roles that had been eliminated during the layoffs. That part made sense, but the reassignment paths didn't. They didn't distribute evenly across the remaining team. Instead, they narrowed, converging toward the same endpoint. Mine. I paused there more than once, checking for errors. There weren't any. The system was consistent. That was when the situation shifted from uncertainty to recognition. Not full understanding, but enough to remove doubt. This wasn't random. It wasn't temporary. It was structured. Around the same time, something else happened. A message appeared in my inbox from someone I hadn't heard from since the layoffs. It was brief. No greeting, no context, just a question. "Are you handling multiple roles now?" I read it carefully. There was no tone attached to it, no implication, just the question. I replied simply, "Yes." There was a delay before the next message came through, then another line. "They mentioned you." I didn't respond immediately. Not because I didn't understand, but because I wanted to be certain of what was being said. After a few minutes, another message followed. "Before the cuts, in meetings." That was all. No explanation, no details, just fragments. I didn't ask for more. Not directly. Instead, I let the conversation continue at its own pace. Over the next few exchanges, the outline became clearer. There had been discussions before the layoffs, internal, limited to management and a few senior staff. My name had come up during those conversations, not in the way I would have expected, not as someone to protect, not as someone to promote, but as someone manageable. The word stayed with me longer than the rest, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it explained something I hadn't been able to define. Manageable didn't refer to skill, it referred to response, predictability, silence, the absence of resistance. I didn't react to the message. I acknowledged it briefly and ended the conversation there, not out of distrust, but because I had enough. More details wouldn't change the structure I was already seeing. The records confirmed the outcome. This explained the selection. I returned to the system after that, looked at the data again, but this time with context. The patterns didn't change. They became clearer. Decisions had been made in spaces I wasn't part of. Documented partially through meeting logs, reflected fully through task distribution. There were gaps, areas where the system didn't show the reasoning behind certain actions. But it didn't need to. The results were consistent enough to stand on their own. I began organizing what I found, not formally, just structured enough that it could be followed if needed. Dates, volumes, comparisons, assignment flows. I didn't attach conclusions to any of it, just the facts. The situation outside didn't change. The workload remained high. The messaging from my boss stayed controlled, neutral, occasionally suggestive. But internally, something had shifted. I was no longer trying to understand if something was wrong. I was documenting how it worked. And for the first time since it started, the uncertainty was gone, replaced by something quieter. Clarity, not complete, but enough. Enough to know that what was happening wasn't accidental. Enough to know that it had been considered in advance. And enough to understand that whatever came next would follow the same pattern. Structured, unspoken, and visible only if you knew where to look. The pressure didn't arrive all at once. It increased in increments, small enough to remain defensible, consistent enough to become unavoidable. At first, it was the deadlines. Tasks that had previously allowed for measured completion were now marked as urgent without explanation. Timelines compressed, sometimes by hours, sometimes by days. The system reflected the change, but not the reasoning behind it. I adjusted again, reordered priorities, deferred lower-impact work, focused on what carried the most immediate visibility. It kept things from breaking, at least on the surface, but the gaps started forming underneath. Work that required depth was interrupted by work that required speed. Context switching became constant. I moved between processes without pause, completing one task while already anticipating the next. Wasn't sustainable, but it wasn't meant to be, not in a balanced way. Messages from my boss became more frequent during this period, not longer, not more detailed, just more frequent. Short check-ins, status, update, timeline, each one isolated, but together they created a pattern of continuous oversight without support. There was no space between them to stabilize the work, only enough time to respond before the next one arrived. I answered each message carefully. Brief, factual. No interpretation. I avoided explanations unless they were necessary. I didn't reference workload or constraints. I only reported what could be confirmed. It seemed to shift his approach slightly. The messages didn't stop, but they changed in tone. Less neutral, more precise. Tasks were now being referenced in ways that suggested closer monitoring. Specific details pulled into the conversation, timestamps, completion markers, minor delays. It meant he was watching the same systems I was. Or at least parts of them. The difference was in how they were being used. For him, they framed expectations. For me, they revealed structure. There were moments during team meetings where the pressure became visible but never directly stated. Updates were called on in sequence. Others spoke first. Their workloads had increased but remained within a range that allowed for explanation. When it reached me, the format changed slightly. More questions, not about the work itself, but about timing. Why did this take longer? Can this be accelerated? Is there a reason for the delay? Each question was valid on its own, but placed in sequence, they created something else, a narrative, one that positioned my output as slower, less efficient, in need of correction. I answered them the same way I responded to messages, directly, without emotion. I provided the sequence of events, the dependencies, the timestamps where they existed. I didn't reference the volume of work behind them. I let the answers stand on their own. The responses I received were consistent, acknowledgement, then movement to the next topic. No resolution, no adjustment, just continuation. Outside of meetings, the pattern intensified. Late-night messages began to appear, not frequently, but often enough to disrupt the boundary between work and rest. Tasks assigned after hours, marked for early completion the next day. No indication that the timing itself was unusual. I didn't respond immediately. I read them, noted them, and addressed them during normal working hours. The follow-up messages would come early. Any update? No reference to the time they had been sent, just expectation. I maintained the same approach. Factual responses, clear timelines, no deviation. At the same time, something else became apparent. Certain tasks were being rooted in ways that created overlap intentionally. Dependencies that could have been sequenced were assigned simultaneously. Information required for one task would only become available after another was completed, but both carried the same deadline. It created built-in delay. And that delay, when measured without context, reflected on me. I documented those instances, not by explaining them, but by capturing their structure. Assignment times, dependency points, completion sequences. The system recorded all of it. I just needed to make sure it could be seen together. The workload itself reached a point where maintaining previous standards required more than adjustment. It required compression. Time reduced to function only. breaks shortened, focus narrowed, everything unnecessary removed. Even then, the margin for error was gone, not reduced, gone. And still the expectations held, unchanged. That was when I understood the final layer of the structure. It wasn't only about increasing output. It was about creating conditions where failure could be attributed clearly, individually, without reference to the system that produced it. I didn't react to that realization. I didn't push back. I didn't change my communication. I continued documenting, more precisely now, more deliberately. Because the pressure, while increasing, was also refining the data, making patterns sharper, easier to follow, harder to dismiss. The situation had tightened, not just in workload, but in visibility. Every action, every delay, every adjustment, it was all being recorded from both sides. The difference was in intention. They were waiting for a break, something visible, something simple enough to point to. I understood that. So I gave them nothing that could be isolated, only what already existed, structured, complete, and connected in ways that wouldn't hold under scrutiny. The pressure continued, but so did the record. And at that point, the record mattered more than the moment. There wasn't a single moment where it became too much. No clear line where I stopped and recognized that something had to change. It accumulated, gradually, quietly, until the effort required to maintain control became its own form of strain. I noticed it in small ways first. The time it took to transition between tasks increased, not because I didn't understand the work, but because there was no space left between them. Each task carried the residue of the previous one, unfinished context, partial focus. It stayed with me longer than it should have. Outside of work, the structure didn't follow, but the pattern did. I started thinking in timelines even when there were none, measuring time in segments, anticipating interruptions that weren't coming. It made rest feel temporary, conditional. I adjusted that too, reduced unnecessary thought, focused only on what was in front of me. The same approach I used during work. It worked to a point, but the underlying weight remained. Not loud, not overwhelming, just consistent. There was a moment late in the evening when I saw it clearly, not as a feeling. As a calculation, I was reviewing the day's assignments, what had been completed, what had carried over, what had been added without context. I mapped them out the way I had been doing for weeks. Volumes, timelines, dependencies, everything aligned with what I already knew. The structure hadn't changed. It had stabilized. This was no longer a temporary phase or an adjustment period. It was the intended state. I stopped there. Not because I was finished, but because continuing wouldn't change the outcome. That was the first time I considered responding differently, not within the system, outside of it, raising the issue formally, escalating, requesting intervention. All of those options existed, and for a brief moment they seemed reasonable, but I followed each one through to its likely result. Not emotionally, structurally. What would be required to prove the imbalance? What would be considered sufficient? Who would interpret it? And how would it be framed? I already had parts of those answers, the conversations I'd had, the way responses were redirected, the narrative that had been forming around my output. If I approached it directly without a complete structure behind it, it would be absorbed into that narrative, reframed, reduced, possibly dismissed. And once that happened, it would be harder to bring it forward again. That was the cost, not of being wrong, of being early. I closed the system without submitting anything, not because I accepted the situation, but because I understood the timing. The response needed to exist in a form that couldn't be redirected, not through conversation, not through interpretation, through structure. I had already started building that without fully acknowledging it. Now it became deliberate. I went back through everything I had collected, not to review it, to organize it, sequences that showed how tasks moved from one role to another, comparisons that highlighted distribution across the team, instances where dependencies created unavoidable delays, communication patterns that reflected expectation without support. I removed anything that required explanation, left only what could be followed, step by step, from origin to outcome. It took time. Not additional time, there wasn't any, but time taken from what would have been rest. I accepted that because the alternative was continuing without clarity, and at that point clarity mattered more. Emotion didn't factor into it. There was no anger in the process, no frustration that needed to be expressed, just a steady recognition of what existed and what needed to be done with it. I stopped trying to correct the situation in real time, stopped adjusting in ways that weren't sustainable. Instead, I focused on maintaining a consistent record, accurate, complete, unaltered. If something shifted, I captured it. If something repeated, I marked it. The goal wasn't to react, it was to preserve, because whatever happened next wouldn't be decided in a conversation. It would be decided in a review, and in that space, only what could be shown would matter. By the end of that week, the internal decision was complete, not visible to anyone else. Nothing in my behavior changed. I responded the same way, delivered the same way, remained as quiet as before, but the approach was different, no longer adaptive. Intentional. I wasn't trying to prove anything yet. I was making sure that when the time came, nothing would need to be added, only revealed. The pressure didn't ease. If anything, it became more focused, but it no longer felt undefined. It had a shape, a structure, and I understood where it led, not to a confrontation, not to a moment, but to a point where the system would reflect itself, without input, without argument, just outcome. That was where I was moving, slowly, deliberately, without signaling it, and without needing anyone to acknowledge it before it happened. The shift did not announce itself. There was no message, no meeting, no visible acknowledgement that anything had changed. If I hadn't been watching the same systems for weeks, I might not have noticed it at all. It started with a delay. Not in my work, but in the responses around it. Tasks I completed stopped receiving immediate follow-up. Approvals that used to move quickly through the system began to pause at certain stages. Not indefinitely, just long enough to create a visible gap between submission and confirmation. I recognized the pattern. It wasn't inefficiency. It was attention. Something was being reviewed more closely than before. I didn't change my approach. I continued working through the assignments as they came, documenting them in the same way. The volume had not decreased yet, but the movement around it had slowed. That was enough. Within a few days, the changes became more defined. Tasks that had previously been routed directly to me began appearing in shared queues first. Not all of them, but enough to alter the flow. From there, some were reassigned elsewhere before reaching me. The distribution was adjusting, gradually, without explanation. I checked the assignment logs again. This time, I noticed something that hadn't been there before: additional access points. Views from accounts that weren't part of the immediate team, not interacting with the tasks, just opening them, reviewing histories, moving through records that until recently had remained within a smaller circle. The system didn't identify intent, but it showed presence. And that presence was new. Meetings began to change as well, subtly. The structure remained the same: updates, timelines, progress, but the tone shifted. Questions that had previously been directed toward me were now distributed more evenly. In some cases, redirected entirely. When my turn came, the questions were fewer, more specific, focused on confirmation rather than challenge. I answered them the same way I always had: clear, measured, without adding context that wasn't requested. There was one meeting where the difference became unmistakable. A delay in a task was brought up, not by my boss, but by someone I didn't recognize on the call. Their role wasn't stated, but their access to the details suggested they were reviewing from outside the team. They referenced timestamps, assignment sequences, dependencies, the same elements I had been documenting. They didn't ask why the delay happened. They asked how the sequence had been structured. It was a different question, one that shifted focus away from outcome and toward process. My boss responded first, briefly, general explanation. Then the question was directed to me. I provided the sequence exactly as it appeared in the system. No interpretation, no justification, just the order of events. There was a pause after I finished, not long, just enough to register. Then the conversation moved on. No conclusion, no correction, but something had changed. After that meeting, the adjustments accelerated. Workload began to redistribute more visibly. Tasks that would have come to me automatically were now being assigned across multiple team members. Deadlines were extended in some cases, aligned more realistically with the volume. No one explained the change. No one acknowledged the previous imbalance. It simply corrected. Quietly. My boss's behavior shifted as well. The frequency of his messages decreased. The tone returned to something closer to what it had been before the layoffs, neutral, controlled, less immediate. He still monitored. That hadn't changed, but the intensity was gone. In its place was distance. Not the original kind. A different version, more cautious, less certain. I didn't respond to the change, not outwardly. I continued working within the adjusted structure, maintaining the same pace, the same level of detail in my responses. There was no reason to alter that. The system was already doing what I needed it to do, reflecting itself, without input, without argument. Whatever review had taken place, it hadn't required my explanation, only my record. By the end of the week, the workload had stabilized into something closer to what it had been before. Not identical, but balanced, sustainable. I could have stopped there. Let the situation resolve itself fully, return to the routine I had before, but something remained, not in the workload, in the structure, the understanding of how easily it had shifted, how quietly it had been directed, and how long it had taken to correct. That didn't disappear with the adjustment. It stayed, unspoken, embedded in the process. Others seemed to move past it quickly. Conversations returned to normal. Collaboration resumed where it had been limited. The visible signs of strain faded, but the system still held the record of what had happened. And so did I. No one mentioned it again. No acknowledgement, no clarification, just a continuation. As if the previous weeks had been a temporary deviation, now resolved. I didn't challenge that. I didn't need to. The outcome had already taken place, not through confrontation, through exposure, and the consequences, while quiet, were already in motion, not visible in a single moment, but present in every adjustment that followed. The system returned to something familiar, not identical, but close enough that, from the outside, it looked unchanged. Tasks arrived within defined boundaries again. Deadlines aligned with the actual scope of work. Communications settled into a predictable rhythm. If someone had joined at that point, they wouldn't have seen anything unusual. There was no visible trace of what had happened, no record that existed in conversation, only in the systems that had already moved past it. I continued working the same way, arriving early, moving through tasks with the same structure, the same attention to detail. Nothing in my process needed to change. But the way I understood it did. My boss didn't address the shift. There was no acknowledgement, no reference to the previous weeks. His interactions with me remained professional, controlled, and minimal, consistent, as if nothing had required adjustment. I responded the same way. There was no reason to do otherwise. The distance between us stayed intact, not increased, not reduced, just defined. Coworkers returned to their routines as well. Conversations resumed. Collaboration reappeared where it had been absent. The gaps closed without discussion. It was efficient and quiet. I didn't correct anyone's understanding of that time. I didn't explain what I had seen or how it had unfolded, because explanation wasn't necessary. The outcome already existed, not as a moment, as a structure that had revealed itself, then corrected. That was enough. The trust I had before didn't return, not in the same form. It wasn't replaced by distrust, just awareness, a recognition of how decisions were made and how they moved through the system without being stated directly. I worked within that understanding, carefully, consistently, without assuming stability meant permanence. Nothing else needed to be said, nothing else needed to happen. The silence returned to what it had always been, not empty, just unspoken. And this time I understood exactly what it could hold.